The rain over Sector 9 did not fall in sheets. It fell as a greasy chemical mist that coated the copper pipes and stained glass domes of the Iron Orchid Conservatory. Deep within the lower tier of the city, away from the pristine glass towers of the Highborn, the air smelled of wet loam, rust, and sweet fermenting nectar. Kaelen Vance stood on an iron catwalk, his fingers buried in the soil of a suspended terracotta trough. He was an Omega, though few who saw his broad shoulders and grease-stained leather apron would guess it. He had spent his life cultivating rare, bioengineered flora, plants designed to scrub the heavy metals out of the lower sector's hair. His scent, usually a quiet mix of crushed mint and damp moss, was buried under the sharp smell of fertilizer and engine oil. Below him, the heavy iron doors of the conservatory hissed open. The mist from the street swirled inward, cut through by a scent that made Kaelen's hands freeze in the dirt. It was cedarwood, sharp winter frost, and pure, unfiltered authority. An alpha had entered the lower tier. Kaelen didn't look down. He kept his back straight, methodically wiping his soil-covered hands on his apron. The conservatory closes at sunset, corporate. If you're looking to buy decorative orchids for a high-tier gala, you're 3 levels too low. I am not looking for orchids, Master Vance, a voice replied. It was deep, resonant, and entirely unbothered by the damp chill of the greenhouse. Kaelen turned slowly, leaning against the iron railing. Standing on the stone floor below was Reid Valerius. The name alone was an empire. Reid was the youngest director of Valerius Biotech, a man whose face was plastered across every digital billboard in the upper district. He wore a tailored dark overcoat that looked absurd against the rusted iron pipes of Sector 9. His expression was cool, his silver eyes tracking the movement of Kaelen's throat. "Reid Valerius," Kaelen said, his voice dropping an octave into a defensive rumble. "I don't remember inviting the board of directors into the mud." "Your latest shipment of aethelfern extracts arrived at our labs yesterday," Reid said, stepping toward the center fountain. He didn't look at the plants. He kept his eyes locked on Kaelen. The purity levels were 98%. Our synthetic synthesizers have been stuck at 70 for 3 years. I came to see the machine behind the miracle. The machine is just dirt, patience, and a family that doesn't sell out to the highest bidder, Kaelen said, descending the iron spiral staircase. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom, keeping himself slightly elevated above the alpha. "The contract states I supply the raw extract. It doesn't state I have to give you the blueprint." Reid tilted his head up, a slow, dangerous smile touching the corner of his lips. The air between them grew thick, a sudden pressure building in Kaelen's chest as Reid's alpha pheromones subtly expanded. "A contract can be rewritten, Kaelen, especially when the city's air filtration license comes up for renewal next month. Valerius Biotech owns the grid. You own the garden. It seems we are stuck with each other." Kaelen felt his inner Omega stir, a sudden hot pulse of recognition that made his knuckles turn white on the iron handrail. He hated it. He hated how his biology instantly recognized the power in the man standing before him. "Get out of my greenhouse, Reid." Reid didn't move for a long moment. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing the petal of a dark purple orchid near the stairs. "Midnight, Kaelen. The board meets to discuss the grid allocation. If you want to keep your lights on, I suggest you bring the next batch of extracts to my office personally." He turned and vanished into the gray mist, leaving Kaelen alone with the smell of frost and cedarwood lingering in the warm air. The upper-tier headquarters of Valerius Biotech was a fortress of white marble and polarized glass. Kaelen felt like a stain on the floor as he walked through the lobby, holding a heavy copper canister of refined extract. His work clothes had been replaced by a simple, dark linen tunic, but he still carried the scent of the earth on him. The private elevator took him straight to the penthouse office. When the doors slid open, he didn't find a boardroom full of executives. He found Reid sitting behind a massive desk of petrified wood, his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "You're late," Reid said without looking up from his digital display. The transit lifts in Sector 9 don't care about corporate schedules, Kaelen replied, setting the copper canister down on the desk with a heavy thud. There's your extract. Sign the release so I can get back to my district. Reid stood up, walking around the desk. He didn't look at the canister. Instead, he stopped inches from Kaelen, his presence overwhelming the small space between them. The board didn't meet last night, Kaelen. Kaelen's eyes narrowed. You lied to me. I needed you here, away from the eyes of the lower-tier watchman, Reid said, his voice dropping into a low, private register. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a physical document, parchment, stamped with a crimson wax seal. This is a corporate merger, not for the Conservatory, for us. Kaelen stared at the paper. What is this? A political match, Reid said, his silver eyes flashing with a sudden, intense hunger. The Valerius family needs an heir with an untainted genetic profile. The high-tier alphas have spent 3 generations poisoning their lineages with synthetic beauty enhancers and cognitive boosters. Your lineage is pure, Kaelen. Your work with the bioflora proves your genetic resistance to the lower-tier rot. Kaelen let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. You want a breeding contract? You think you can just buy an Omega from the slums to fix your family's broken bloodline? I don't want a contract, Kaelen. I want you, Reid said, his hand moving with lightning speed to grip Kaelen's jaw. The touch was electric, a sudden surge of heat that made Kaelen's knees weak. Reid's scent flared, no longer sterile, but wild, possessive, and ancient. I've spent months watching you through those security feeds. You think you're a gardener? You're a king in the dirt. Combine your mind with my resources, and we take this entire city off the grid. Kaelen tried to pull back, but his own body betrayed him. His scent, the sweet, vulnerable mint, flooded the office, answering the Alpha's call. I don't belong in a cage, Valerius. It's not a cage if you hold the key, Reid whispered, his thumb brushing against Kaelen's lips. Stay with me. Let me mark you before the board finds out what we're building. Once the bond is set, they can't touch you without declaring war on me. For 3 weeks, the city believed a miracle had happened. The rough-edged gardener from Sector 9 lived in the high-tier penthouse, his wild Omega energy perfectly balancing the Alpha's cold intellect. They worked late into the night, their minds fusing over blueprints for a citywide filtration system that would render Valerius Biotech's synthetic medicines obsolete. It wasn't just a bond of biology. It was a madness of shared vision. In the quiet hours before dawn, Reid would bury his face in Kaelen's neck, his teeth resting against the unmarred scent gland. Soon, Reid would murmur, just a few more adjustments to the patent, and we leave them with nothing. But true love in a city built on glass is a dangerous vulnerability. The conspiracy struck on the eve of the winter solstice. Kaelen was alone in the laboratory, adjusting the nutrient balance of the core aethal strain when the security doors locked automatically. The bright white lights of the lab flickered, turning a harsh emergency red. The main display screen flared to life, showing Director Gareth, Reid's uncle, and the true power behind the board. His face was twisted into a cold, triumphant sneer. Master Vance, Gareth said through the audio link. You really should have checked the ownership clauses of your family's conservatory before signing the residence agreement with my nephew. Kaelen stepped back from the console, his hand dropping to the heavy iron wrench on the table. Where is Reid? Reid is currently attending an emergency board session, Gareth replied smoothly. He is signing over the complete intellectual property rights of your bioflora strain to the company's military division. In exchange, the board has agreed to overlook his domestic indiscretions with a lower-tier resident. You're lying, Kaelen spat, though a cold dread began to pool in his stomach. Reid would never let you touch the strain. He didn't have a choice, Gareth said. An alpha's ambition always outweighs his sheets, Kaelen. He used you to extract the formula. Look at your terminal. Reid was there, surrounded by older alphas. He looked pale, his expression unreadable as he pressed his digital signet ring onto a contract. The text on the screen clearly read, Transfer of all lower-tier botanical assets to Valerius Defense. Kaelen's heart shattered. The bond within him, the fragile, beautiful connection he had allowed himself to trust, felt like a hot iron twisting in his chest. Before he could process the pain, the laboratory doors opened, and 4 heavily armed corporate security guards stepped into the room. "The director has ordered your relocation to the outer sectors, Master Vance," the lead guard said, his rifle leveled at Kaelen's chest. "Your presence in the upper district is no longer required." Kaelen didn't fight. The madness that had driven him for the past month, the belief that an alpha like Reid could love something outside his ledger, vanished, leaving behind an icy, dead calm. He allowed them to drag him to the cargo elevator, his mind completely dark. When Reid broke through the security barrier an hour later, his coat torn and his eyes wild with a terrifying, unhinged fury, the lab was empty. The only thing left was Kaelen's leather apron, dropped carelessly onto the floor, and the faint, dying scent of crushed mint. Reid turned on his uncle, who stood in the doorway with a team of guards. "Where is he?" Reid's voice was no longer human. It was an alpha's roar that made the glass partitions vibrate. "He's where he belongs, Reid," Gareth said, unaffected. "You have the patent, the company is secure, forget the Omega." Reid let out a low, terrifying laugh that made even the armed guards step back. The cold, logical director was gone. In his place stood something broken, dangerous, and completely mad. "You think I did this for the patent? You think I gave you the formula to save your company?" Reid stepped closer, his silver eyes completely overtaken by a dark, predatory amber. "I gave you the formula because it's unstable without my blood sequence. Within 48 hours, every crop in your military labs will turn into toxic rot. You haven't saved the company, Uncle. You've just given me an excuse to burn it to the ground." 5 months passed. The city of Neo-Venezia began to choke. Just as Reid had promised, the stolen aethal strains within the high-tier labs degraded into a black, oily mold that spread through the city's central filtration system. The upper sectors, once pristine, were now filled with the same foul chemical smog that had plagued the slums for decades. The corporate shares of Valerius Biotech were in freefall, and the board was in a state of absolute panic. Deep within the forgotten wastes of Sector 12, a place where the city's drainage pipes emptied into the salt flats, Kaelen lived in a makeshift greenhouse made of scavenged plastic sheets and rusted iron ribs. He was thinner now, his face pale, his movements slow. He was pregnant. He had kept the secret from everyone, living like a ghost among the outcasts. The child within him was a constant, heavy warmth, a reminder of the madness he had left behind in the towers. He spent his days nursing a single, survival strain of the aethal fern, the only pure sample left in the world. One evening, as the toxic red sun set over the salt flats, the plastic walls of his greenhouse rattled. The sound of a heavy, high-performance engine cut through the silence of the waste. Kaelen didn't stand up. He kept his hands on his stomach, his breathing steady as the door of the plastic shelter was ripped open. It was Reid. The alpha looked like a specter from a nightmare. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a tattered leather jacket covered in grease and dust. His face was hollow, his silver hair long and unkempt, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying, obsessive light. He looked completely insane, driven mad by 5 months of searching through the digital wasteland for a bond he had lost. "Kaelen," Reid whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. He took a step forward, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the Omega. "Stop," Kaelen said, his voice cold as the salt flats outside. "Don't come near me, Valerius. I don't have any more formulas for your board." "The board is dead," Reid said, letting out a wild, breathless laugh. "I killed it. I dragged Gareth out of his office 3 weeks ago and forced him to sign the dissolution papers. Valerius Biotech doesn't exist anymore, Kaelen. I destroyed the towers. I destroyed everything." Kaelen stared at him, seeing the raw, unhinged truth in the alpha's face. Reid hadn't come to salvage his empire. He had torn it down because it stood between him and his mate. "Why?" Kaelen asked, his voice softening just a fraction. Because the city was loud and I couldn't hear your breath, Reid said, dropping to his knees in the dirt before Kaelen. He leaned his head against Kaelen's knees, his shoulders shaking as he wept, a display of total submission that no alpha of his status had ever shown. They took you from the lab. I signed the papers because they told me they would kill you if I didn't give them the sequence. I lied to them, Kaelen. I poisoned the strain so they could never use it against us. I've spent every day since then looking for you. Please, let me come home. As Reid spoke, his scent, the pure, familiar winter frost and cedarwood, flooded the small greenhouse. The child within Kaelen stirred a sudden, happy pulse that resonated through their shared biology. Kaelen looked down at the broken king, kneeling in the dirt at his feet. The anger that had sustained him for 5 months melted away, replaced by the terrifying realization that their love was a form of madness that neither of them could ever cure. Kaelen reached down, his dirt-stained fingers gently tangling in Reid's silver hair. "You're a fool, Reid Valerius." Reid snapped his head up, his eyes wide. As his gaze dropped to Kaelen's swollen stomach, his breath hitched. He reached out with a reverence that was almost holy, pressing his calloused palm against the linen of Kaelen's tunic. A sharp, powerful kick answered his touch. "A child," Reid whispered, a look of pure, unadulterated awe replacing the madness in his eyes. "Our child. A child of the dirt," Kaelen said, a small, tired smile finally breaking across his face. "If you stay here, there are no executive suites, Reid. There are no servants. There is only the soil and the plants." "I don't want the world, Kaelen," Reid said, standing up and pulling Kaelen gently into his arms. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the silver bond mark on Kaelen's neck that had never truly faded. "I only want the garden." 3 years later, the city of Neo-Venezia was no longer gray. The corporate district's glass towers were still there, but they were covered in a living, breathing network of green vines and bioengineered ferns. The Iron Orchid Conservatory had expanded, its glass domes now stretching across 3 whole sectors of the lower tier. The air was clean, smelling of sweet earth and fresh rain. In the center of the main dome, a 3-year-old boy with silver eyes and dark, unruly hair was chasing a mechanical butterfly through a patch of neon blue orchids. Kaelen stood by the main irrigation valves, his leather apron back on, his face full of life and color. He watched his son laugh, a deep sense of peace settling over him. A pair of strong arms wrapped around his waist from behind, and the familiar, grounding scent of cedarwood and frost enveloped him. Reid leaned his chin on Kaelen's shoulder, his hands resting over Kaelen's on the valve handle. He looked healthier now, the wild madness of his exile replaced by a quiet, fierce contentment. "The northern sector's filtration grid went live this morning," Reid murmured, kissing Kaelen's cheek. "The air purity is at 99%. The council tried to offer me a seat on the new municipal board." Kaelen turned in his arms, his loop of yarn catching on Reid's shirt button. "And what did you tell them, Director?" "I told them I already report to a higher authority," Reid smiled, looking down at Kaelen with an intensity that had never faded over the years. He reached down, picking up his son as the boy ran up to his legs, lifting him high into the warm air of the greenhouse. The storm outside had passed, and for the first time in the history of the city, the sun that shone through the glass was completely clear. They had lost an empire, but in the ruins of the old world, they had built a sanctuary where choices were free, and love was the only law that remained.